"Sir, I need you to adjust your support hand. That thumb over bore grip hasn't been taught in years. What you're doing belongs in the Vietnam era." Staff Sergeant Bod Larkin said it loudly enough for everyone on the firing line to hear. The laminated training checklist was tucked beneath his arm, and the dozen students stretched across the mats fell silent. It was the kind of silence that settles over a group right before someone decides whether to laugh. A few younger shooters exchanged amused looks. Several phones came up. Delma Pruitt never looked away from his rifle. Beneath the brim of a faded ball cap molded by 2 decades of wear, he calmly pressed his left thumb across the top of the handguard, settled his elbow deeper into the sandbag, and aligned his eye with the target 300 yards away. It was the same measured movement he had repeated thousands upon thousands of times. Within 2 minutes, every phone pointed in his direction would capture something none of those people expected to witness. And every one of them would want to watch it again. If you believe that a skill forged under real pressure can remain valuable decades later, and if you ever carried home lessons from Vietnam that manuals never properly acknowledged, this story is for you. Larkin had already moved on toward the next shooter. He had no idea whose morning he had just interrupted. Delma Pruitt was 77 years old. He had spent enough winters in the foothills of North Carolina that he no longer fought the cold. He simply worked around it. He stood 5'9" in worn boots that had already lived through more than one owner. His frame was lean, his shoulders slightly bent forward. It wasn't only age. It was the posture that comes from a lifetime of lowering yourself into prone positions and staying there. His flannel shirt remained buttoned at the wrists even on warm days, a habit left over from decades spent clearing brush and working land he no longer farmed. The softness around his jaw revealed his years. His eyes did not. They still measured distance with an ease many younger men never develop. But his hands revealed the truth to anyone who knew where to look. Arthritis had swollen the knuckles. The fingers no longer straightened completely. Yet on the pad of his left thumb sat a smooth, hardened callus unlike anything else on him. It wasn't from carpentry. It wasn't from gardening. It wasn't from ordinary outdoor work. It was the mark left by pressure applied in precisely the same spot, at the same angle, year after year after year. His home sat at the end of a gravel driveway beneath a ridgeline his wife Arlene always said reminded her of the hills near Boone where she grew up. That was why they bought the place 51 years earlier. And why neither of them ever wanted to leave. Inside the house, her chair still faced his near the front window. An unfinished Afghan rested over one arm. The knitting needles remained exactly where she had left them. Delma dusted around the chair every few days. He had never moved the needles. Arlene died the previous winter. A patch of ice on the porch had sent her falling. The broken hip led to complications. Pneumonia finished what the fall began. Most evenings Delma still sat in his own chair and watched the ridgeline fade into purple twilight. The difference was that no one sat across from him anymore to share the view. He had come to Camp Varick that Saturday because his grandson, a Marine stationed a couple of hours away, had arranged a guest spot for him at a weekend precision rifle clinic. Nothing complicated. Just a grandson hoping a morning outdoors might help an old man who had spent too much time alone. Delma accepted without argument. When he stepped out of the truck that morning, the first thing that reached him wasn't the sight of the range. It was the smell. Gun oil. Cold morning air. Coffee growing bitter in someone's thermos. Something inside him recognized those scents before his mind fully caught up. He walked the firing line once, studying sandbags and wind flags the way another man might glance around a familiar room. Before leaving home that morning, he had locked the front door and turned back toward the porch. A small private ritual. Meaningless to everyone else. Important to him. The range slowly came alive. Chronographs beeped. Students compared equipment. Low conversations drifted across the line. Staff Sergeant Larkin moved among the shooters carrying his modern rifle system and laminated checklist. Everything about him suggested a man who selected his gear with purpose. He stopped beside a young corporal struggling with shots drifting low and left. Within moments Larkin identified the problem. The trigger finger was reaching too deeply into the guard and pulling rounds offline. He corrected it. The next 3 shots landed perfectly. Larkin was good. No one would deny that. When he reached Delma's position, a younger student had already arrived first. "Your eyes still good enough for 300 yards, he joked. Delma simply replied that they worked fine and continued adjusting his sandbag. Larkin studied him. The flannel shirt. The faded cap. The thumb already settling over the handguard. "I've never seen a group that tight from someone shooting prone without a bipod and chassis setup." For the first time in a very long while, his hands rested quietly in his lap. And the notebook was finally closed. The Afghan rested neatly across the arm of Arlene's chair. No unfinished stitches remained. No needles were left waiting. Nothing had been abandoned halfway. Delma eased himself back into his chair and looked out toward the darkening ridgeline one last time before the final traces of daylight disappeared. For the first time in many months, the notebook that had traveled with him for more than half a century remained closed in his lap. Not because its lessons no longer mattered. Not because its memories had faded. But because, at last, one of the burdens it carried had found its way home. Wallace Tibbets was no longer just a name written on a folded flag sitting on a mantle. He was no longer a question left unanswered for generations. His story had been spoken aloud. The truth had reached the family that had waited decades to hear it. And somewhere in that quiet exchange between an aging Marine and a sergeant major who never expected answers, a circle had finally closed. Outside, the wind moved gently along the ridge. Inside, the house remained still. The same chair. The same window. The same evening light that Arlene had watched beside him for so many years. Yet something felt different. Not lighter. Like hands that no longer needed to grip so tightly. Like a man who had spent 57 years carrying a lesson born from a single missed shot and had finally passed it on to someone else. The younger Marines at Camp Varick would continue learning modern systems. They would use newer equipment. Faster techniques. More advanced technology. And they should. But now, tucked inside the clinic's permanent archive, sat a lesson that had been purchased at a cost no manual could fully explain. A reminder that not every old method survives because people are resistant to change. Sometimes it survives because reality tested it under conditions most people never have to face. Sometimes a lesson endures because someone paid for it with pain. And sometimes the wisdom that looks outdated is simply wisdom that has already proven itself. Delma understood that better than anyone. The callus on his thumb remained. The ache in his knees remained. The empty chair across from him remained. But that evening, as darkness settled over the ridgeline, none of those things felt quite the same. He sat quietly for a long while. No television. No radio. Just the sounds of the house settling around him. And for the first time since winter, he found himself looking at Arlene's chair without feeling the need to look away. The Afghan was finished. The notebook was closed. And some stories, after being carried for nearly 6 decades, had finally reached their proper ending. Years later, the students who had been on that firing line would remember the shots. They would remember the impossible grouping. They would remember the old Marine who quietly proved that experience could still stand beside innovation. But the ones who paid the closest attention would remember something else. They would remember that the lesson had never really been about marksmanship. The rifle was only the vehicle. The target was only the excuse. The real lesson was about responsibility. About what happens when a mistake costs more than pride. About carrying the weight of that mistake without allowing it to destroy the rest of your life. Most people spend their years trying to forget painful memories. Delma had spent 57 years making sure he remembered one. Not because he wanted to suffer. Because he believed forgetting would dishonor the man who never came home. Every time his thumb settled into that familiar position, he remembered Wallace. Every time he lowered himself into the dirt, he remembered Wallace. Every careful shot, every patient hold, every lesson passed to another shooter carried a small piece of that memory forward. That was the true purpose of the grip. Not comfort. Not tradition. Remembrance. The world often celebrates the newest idea. The latest improvement. The modern solution. And many times it should. But there is a danger in believing that age alone determines value. Some knowledge survives because it works. Some wisdom survives because it was tested in places where failure carried consequences too severe to ignore. The young Marines who trained after Delma would never see the jungles he saw. They would never know the exact circumstances that created that lesson. And Delma was grateful for that. No generation should have to earn wisdom the hard way if it can be taught another way. That was the entire point of passing it on. The best lessons are not the ones we keep. They are the ones we leave behind. As the night deepened outside his window, Delma rested his hands on the arms of his chair and listened to the quiet. The ridgeline had disappeared completely into darkness now. Yet he could still picture it. Just as he could still picture Arlene sitting across from him. Just as he could still picture Wallace beside him all those years ago. Time had taken many things. Friends. Youth. Strength. Certainty. But it had not taken the meaning of what they had shared. Those things remained. Not frozen in the past. Carried forward. And perhaps that is what endurance truly means. Not refusing to change. Not clinging to old ways simply because they are old. But preserving what remains true, even as everything around it changes. Delma closed his eyes for a moment. The house was quiet. The Afghan was finished. The notebook was closed. The story had finally been told. And for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing left that needed holding together through sheer force of will. Only gratitude. Only memory. Only peace. Outside, the wind moved softly across the ridge. Inside, an old Marine sat in the silence, knowing that some lessons outlive the people who teach them. And some promises, once carried long enough, finally become light enough to set down.